Merlin's Gun by Alastair Reynolds. Punishment saved Sora. If her marksmanship had not been the worst in her class, she would never have been assigned the task of overseeing proctors down in ship's docks. She would not have had to stand for hours, alone except for her familiar, running a laser stylus across the ore samples the proctors brought back to the Swallow ship, dreaming of finishing shift and meeting Verdin. It was boring, menial work. But because the docks were open to vacuum, it was work that required a pressure suit. "Got to be a drill," she said, when the attack began. "No," her familiar said, "it really does seem as if they've caught up with us." Sora's calm evaporated. "How many?" 4 elements of the swarm, standard attack pattern, coherent matter weapons at maximum range. Nova mine countermeasures deployed but seemingly ineffective. Initial damage reports severe and likely underestimates. The floor pitched under her feet. The knee-high androform proctors looked to each other nervously. The machines had no more experience of battle than Sora, and unlike her, they had never experienced the simulations of war creche. Sora dropped the clipboard. "What do I do?" "My advice," her familiar said, "is that you engage that old mammalian flight response and run like hell." She obeyed. Stooping down low-ceilinged corridors festooned with pipes, snaking around hand-painted murals that showed decisive battles from the cohort's history, squadrons of ships exchanging fire, worlds wreathed in flame. The end game was much swifter than those languid paintings suggested. The swarm had been chasing Snipe for 9 years of ship time, during which time Sora had passed through war creche to adulthood. Yet beyond the ship's relativistic frame of reference, nearly 60 years had passed. Captain Chagra had done all that she could to lose the swarm. Her last gamble had been the most desperate of all, using the vicious gravity of a neutron star to slingshot the Swallow ship on another course, one that the chasing ships ought not to have been able to follow, unless they skimmed the neutron star even more suicidally. But they had, forcing Snipe to slow from relativistic flight and nurse its wounds in a fallow system. It was there that the swarm attacked. Near the end, the floor drifted away from her feet as ship's gravity faltered, and she had to progress hand over hand. "This is wrong," Sora said, arriving in the pod bay. "This part should be pressurized. And where is everyone?" "Attack must be a lot worse than those initial reports suggested. I advise you get into a pod as quickly as you can." "I can't go. Not without Verdin." "Let me worry about him." Knowing better than to argue, Sora climbed into the nearest of the cylindrical pods, mounted on a railed pallet ready for injection into the tunnel. The lid clammed shut, air rushing in. "What about Verdin?" "Safe. The attack was bad, but I'm hearing reports that the aft sections made it." "Get me out of here, then." "With all pleasure." Acceleration came suddenly, numbness gloving her spine. "I've got worse news," her familiar said. The voice was an echo of Sora's own, but an octave lower and calmer, like a slightly older and more sensible sister. "I'm sorry, but I had to lie to you. My highest duty is your preservation. I knew that if I didn't lie, you wouldn't save yourself." Sora thought about that, while she watched the ship die from the vantage point of her pod. The Husker weapons had hit its middle sphere, barely harming the parasol of the Swallow scoop. Bodies fell into space, stiff and tiny as snowflakes. Light licked from the sphere. Snipe became a flower of hurting whiteness, darkening as it bloomed. "What did you lie about?" "About Verdin. I'm sorry. He didn't make it. None of them did." Sora waited for the impact of the words, aware that what she felt now was only a precursor to the shock, like the moment when she touched the hot barrel of a gun in war creche, and her fingers registered the heat, but the pain itself did not arrive instantly, giving her time to prepare for its sting. She waited, for what she knew, in all likelihood, would be the worst thing she had ever felt. And waited. "What's wrong with me?" Why don't I feel anything? Because I'm not allowing it. Not just now. If you opt to grieve at some later point, then I can restore the appropriate brain functions. Sora thought about that too. You couldn't make it sound any more clinical, could you? Don't imagine this is easy for me, Sora. I don't exactly have a great deal of experience in this matter. Well, now you're getting it. She was alone. No arguing with that. None of the other crew had survived, and she had only made it because she was on punishment duty for her failings as a soldier. No use looking for help. The nearest cohort mother base was 70 light-years toward the galactic core. Even if there were swallow ships within broadcast range, it would take decades for the nearest to hear her. Decades again for them to curve around and rescue her. No, she would not be rescued. She would drift here, circling a nameless sun, until her energy reserves could not even sustain Frostwatch. What about the enemy? Sora said, seized by an urge to gaze upon her nemesis. Where are the bastards? A map of the system scrolled on the faceplate of her helmet, overlaid with the 4 Husker ships that had survived the slingshot around the neutron star. They were near the 2 ways that punched through the system, marked on the map as fine, straight floors, surrounded by shaded hazard regions. Perhaps, like the cohort, the Huskers were trying to find a way to enter the waynet without being killed, trying to gain the final edge in a war that had lasted 23,000 years. The Huskers had been at war with the cohort ever since these ruthless alien cyborgs had emerged from ancient Dyson spheres near the galactic core. They're not interested in me, Sora said. They know that even if anyone survived the attack, they won't survive much longer. That's right, isn't it? They're nothing if not pragmatic. I want to die. I want you to put me to sleep painlessly and then kill me. You can do that, can't you? I mean, if I order it. Sora did not complete her next thought. What happened instead was that her consciousness stalled, except for the awareness of the familiar, thoughts bleeding into her own. She had experienced something like this stalling aboard Snipe when the crew went into Frostwatch for the longest transits between engagements, but no Frostwatch had ever felt this long. After an age, her thoughts oozed back to life. She groped for the mental routines that formed language. You lied again. This time I plead innocence. I just put you in a position where you couldn't give me the order you were about to. Seemed the best thing under the circumstances. I'll bet it did. In that instant of stalled thought, the pod had turned opaque, concealing the starscape and the debris of the ship. What else? The pod turned glassy across its upper surface, revealing a slowly wheeling starscape above filthy ice. The glass, once perfectly transparent, now had a smoky luster. Once you were sleeping, the familiar said, I used the remaining fuel to guide the pod to a cometary shard. It seemed safer than drifting. How long? Sora was trying to guess from the state of the pod, but the interior looked as new as when she had ejected from Snipe. The sudden smokiness of the glass was alarming, however. Sora did not want to think how many years of cosmic ray abrasion would be required to scuff the material to that degree. Are we talking years, or decades, or more than that? Shall I tell you why I woke you first? If it's going to make any difference. I think it makes all the difference, quite frankly. The familiar paused for effect. Someone has decided to pay this system a visit. Sora saw it on the map now, revised to account for the new relative positions of the celestial bodies in this system. The new ship was denoted by a lilac arrow, moving slowly between waynet transit nodes, the thickened points where the way lines intercepted the ecliptic plane. It must have a functioning syrinx, Sora said, marvelling, and for the first time feeling as if death was not the immediately preferable option. It must be able to use the ways. Worth waking you up for, I think. Sora had 8 hours to signal the ship before it reached the other node of the waynet. She left the pod, stiff, aching and disorientated, but basically functional, and walked to the edge of a crater, one that the Familiar had mapped some years earlier. 3,000 years earlier, to be precise, for that was how long it had taken to scratch the sheen from the glass. The news had been shocking at first, until Sora realized that the span of time was not in itself important. All that she had ever known was the ship. Now that it was gone, it hardly mattered how much time had passed. Yet now there was this newcomer. Sora crisscrossed the crater, laying a line of metallic monofilament, doubling back on her trail many times until a glistening scribble covered the crater. It looked like the work of a drunken spider, but the Familiar assured her it would focus more than satisfactorily at radio frequencies. As for the antenna, that was where Sora came in. Her suit was sheathed in a conductive epidermis, a shield against plasma and ion beam weaponry. By modulating current through it, the Familiar could generate pulses of radio emission. The radio waves would fly away from Sora in all directions, but a good fraction would be reflected back from the crater in parallel lines. Sora had to make gliding jumps from one rim of the crater to the other, so that she passed through the focus momentarily, synchronized to the intervals when the other ship entered view. After 2 hours of light transit time, the newcomer vectored toward the shard. When it was much closer, Sora secreted herself in a snow hole and set her suit to thermal stealth mode. The ship nosed in, stiletto sleek, devilishly hard to see against the stars. It was elongated, carbon black, and nubbed by propulsion modules and weapons of unguessable function arrayed around the hull like remora. Yet it carried cohort markings and had none of the faintly organic attributes of a Husker vessel. Purple flames knifed from the ship's belly, slowing it over the crater. After examining the mirror, the ship moved toward the pod and anchored itself to the ice with grapples. How did something that small ever get here? Doesn't need to be big, the Familiar said, not if it uses the waynets. After a few minutes, an access ramp lowered down, kissing the ice. A space-suited figure ambled down the ramp. He moved toward the pod, kicking up divots of frost. The man, he was clearly male, judging by the contours of his suit, knelt down and examined the pod. Ribbed and striped by luminous paint, his suit made him seem naked, scarred by ritual marks of warriorhood. He fiddled with the sleeve, unspooling something before shunting it into a socket in the side of the pod. Then he stood there, head slightly cocked. "Nosy bastard," Sora whispered. "Don't be so ungrateful. He's trying to rescue you." "Are you in yet?" Can't be certain. The Familiar had copied part of itself into the pod before Sora had left. His suit might not even have the capacity to store me. "I'm going to make my presence known." "Be careful, will you?" Sora stood, dislodging a flurry of ice. The man turned to her sharply, the spool disengaging from the pod and whisking back into his sleeve. The stripes on his suit flicked over to livid reds and oranges. He opened a fist to reveal something lying in his palm, a designator for the weapons on the ship, swivelling out from the hull like snakes' heads. "If I were you," the Familiar said, "I'd assume the most submissive posture you can think of." Sod that. Sora took steps forward, trying not to let her fear translate into clumsiness. Her radio chirped to indicate that she was online to the other suit. "Who are you? Can you understand me?" "Perfectly well," the man said, after negligible hesitation. His voice was deep and actorly, devoid of any accent Sora knew. "Your cohort. We speak Maine, give or take a few kilo-years of linguistic drift." "You speak it pretty well for someone who's been out there for 10,000 years. "And how would one know that?" "Do the sums. Your ship's from 7,000 years earlier than my own era, and I've just taken 3,000 years of catnap." Ah. Perhaps if I'd arrived in time to waken you with a kiss, you wouldn't be quite so grumpy. But your point was? We shouldn't be able to understand each other at all, which makes me wonder if you're lying to me. I see. For a moment she thought he heard him chuckling to himself, almost a cat-like purring. What I'm wondering is why I need to listen to this stuff and nonsense, given that I'm not the one in current need of rescuing. His suit calmed, aggressor markings cooling to neutral blues and yellows. He let his hand drop slowly. I'd say, the familiar said, that he has a fairly good point. Sora stepped closer. I'm a little edgy, that's all. Comes with the territory. You were attacked? Slightly. A swarm took out my swallow ship. Bad show, the man said, nodding. Haven't seen swallow ships for 2.5 kilo years. Too hard for the Halo factories to manufacture once the Huskers started targeting mother bases. The cohort regressed again, fell back on fusion pulse drives. Before very long, they'll be back to generation starships and chemical rockets. Thanks for all the sympathy. Sorry, it wasn't my intention to sound callous. It's simply that I've been travelling. It gives one a certain, how shall I say, loftiness of perspective. Means I've kept more up to date with current affairs than you have. That's how I understand you. With his free hand he tapped the side of his helmet. I've a database of languages running halfway back to the flourishing. Bully for you. Who are you, by the way? Ah, of course. Introductions. He reached out the free hand, this time in something approximating welcome. Merlin. It was impossible. It cut against all common sense, but she knew who he was. It was not that they had ever met, but everyone knew of Merlin. There was no word for him other than legend. 7, or more properly 10,000 years ago, it was Merlin who had stolen something from the cohort, vanishing into the galaxy on a quest for what could only be described as a weapon too dreadful to use. He had never been seen again. Until, apparently, now. Thanks for rescuing me, Sora said, when he had shown her to the bridge of the ship he called Tyrant, a spherical chamber outfitted with huge black control seats, facing a window of flawless metasapphire overlooking cometary ice. Don't overdo the gratitude, the familiar said. Merlin shrugged. You're welcome. And sorry if I acted a little edgy. Forget it. As you say, comes with the territory. Actually, I'm rather glad I found you. You wouldn't believe how scarce human company is these days. Nobody ever said it was a friendly galaxy. Less so now, believe me. Now the cohort started losing whole star systems. I've seen world after world shattered by the Huskers, whole strings of orbiting habitats gutted by nuclear fire. The war's in its terminal stages, and the cohort isn't in anything resembling a winning position. Merlin leaned closer to her, sudden enthusiasm burning in his eyes. But I've found something that can make a difference, Sora. Or at least, I have rather a good idea where one might find it. She nodded slowly. Let's see. That wouldn't be Merlin's fabulous gun, by any chance. You're still not entirely sure I'm who I say I am, are you? I've 1 or 2 nagging doubts. You're right, of course. He sighed theatrically and gestured around the bridge. In the areas not reserved for control readouts, the walls were adorned with treasure, trinkets, finery, and jewels of staggering artistry and beauty, glinting with the hues of the rarest alloys, inset with precious stones, shaped by the finest lapidary skill of 1,000 worlds. There were chips of subtly coloured ceramic or tiny white light holograms of great brilliance. There were daggers and brooches, ornate ceremonial lasers and bracelets, terrible swords and grotesque, carnelian-eyed carnival masks. "I thought," Merlin said, "that this would be enough to convince you." He had sloughed the outer layer of his suit, revealing himself to be what she had on some level feared, a handsome, broad-shouldered man who in every way conformed to the legend she had in mind. Merlin, dressed luxuriously, encrusted in jewellery which was, nonetheless, at the dour end of the spectrum compared to what was displayed on the walls. His beard was carefully trimmed, and his long auburn hair hung loose, evoking leonine strength. He radiated magnificence. "Oh, it's pretty impressive," Sora said, "even if a good fraction of it must have been looted. And maybe I am half convinced. But you have to admit, it's quite a story." "Not from my perspective." He was fiddling with an intricate ring on one forefinger. "Since I left on my quest," he spoke the word with exquisite distaste, "I've lived rather less than 11 years of subjective time. I was as horrified as anyone when I found my little hunt had been magnified into something so epic." "Bet you were." "When I left, there was an unstated expectation that the war could be won within a handful of centuries." Merlin snapped his fingers at a waiting proctor and had it bring a bowl of fruit. Sora took a plum, examining it suspiciously before consigning it to her mouth. "But even then," Merlin continued, "things were on the turn. I could see it, if no one else could." "So you became a mercenary?" "Freelancer, if you don't mind. Point was, I realized that I could better serve humanity outside the cohort, and old legends kept tickling the back of my mind." He smiled. "You see, even legends are haunted by legends." He told her the rest, which, in diluted form, she already knew. Yet it was fascinating to hear it from Merlin's lips, to hear the kernel of truth at the core of something around which falsehoods and half-truths had accreted like dust around a protostar. He had gathered many stories from dozens of human cultures predating the cohort, spread across thousands of light years and dispersed through tens of thousands of years of history. The similarities were not always obvious, but Merlin had sifted common patterns, piecing together, as well as he could, an underlying framework of what might just be fact. "There'd been another war," Merlin said, "smaller than ours, spread across a much smaller volume of space, but no less brutal for all that." "How long ago was this?" 40 or 45 kilo-years ago, not long after the Waymakers vanished, but about 20 Ks before anything we'd recognize as the cohort." Merlin's eyes seemed to glaze over, an odd, stentorian tone entered his voice. "In the long, dark centuries of mid-galactic history, when 1,000 cultures rose, each imagining themselves immune to time, and whose shadows barely reached us across the millennia." "Yes, very poetic. What kind of war, anyway? Human versus human or human versus alien, like this one?" "Does it matter?" "Whoever the enemy were, they aren't coming back. Whatever was used against them was so deadly, so powerful, so awesome, that it stopped an entire war." "Merlin's gun." He nodded, lips tight, looking almost embarrassed. "As if I had some prior claim on it, or was even in some sense responsible for it." He looked at Sora very intently, the glittering finery of the ship reflected in the gold of his eyes. "I haven't seen the gun, or even been near it, and it's only recently that I've had anything like a clear idea of where it might actually be." "But you think you know where it is?" "I think so. It isn't far. And it's in the eye of a storm." They lifted from the Shard, spending 8 days in transit to the closest way, most of the time in Frostwatch. Sora had her own quarters, a spherical walled suite deep in Tyrant's thorax, outfitted in maroon and burgundy. The ship was small, but fascinating to explore, an object lesson in the differences between the cohort that had manufactured this ship and the one Sora had been raised in. In many respects, the ship was more advanced than anything from her own time, especially in the manner of its propulsion, defences, and sensors. In other areas, the cohort had gained expertise since Merlin's era. Merlin's proctors were even stupider than those Sora had been looking after when the Husker attack began. There were no familiars in Merlin's time, either, and she saw no reason to educate him about her own neural symbiote. "Well," Sora said when she was alone, "what can you tell me about the legendary Merlin?" "Nothing very much at this point." The familiar had been communicating with the version of itself that had infiltrated Tyrant via Merlin's suit. "If he's impersonating the historical figure we know as Merlin, he's gone to extraordinary lengths to make the illusion authentic. All the logs confirm that his ship left cohort-controlled space around 10 kilo-years ago, and that he's been travelling ever since." "He's back from somewhere. It would help if we knew where." "Tricky, given that we have no idea about the deep topology of the Waynet. I can search the star fields for recognizable features, but it'll take a long time, and there'll still be a large element of guesswork." "There must be something you can show me." "Of course." The familiar sounded slightly affronted. "I found images. Some of the formats are obscure, but I think I can make sense of most of them." And even before Sora had answered, the familiar had warmed a screen in one hemisphere of the suite. Visual records of different solar systems appeared, each entry displayed for a second before being replaced. Each consisted of an orbital map. Planets and Waynet nodes were marked relative to each system's sun. The worlds were annotated with enlarged images of each, overlaid with sparse astrophysical and military data showing the roles, if any, they had played in the war. Merlin had visited other places too. Squid-like protostellar nebulae stained with green and red and flecked by the light of hot blue stars. Supernova remnants, the eviscera of gored stars, 100 of which had died since the flourishing, briefly outshining the galaxy. "What do you think he was looking for?" Sora said. "These points must have been on the Waynet, but they're a long way from anything we'd call civilization." "I don't know. Souvenir hunting?" "Are you sure Merlin can't tell you're accessing this information?" "Absolutely. But why should it bother him unless he's got something to hide?" "Debatable point." Sora looked around to the sealed door of her quarters, half expecting Merlin to enter at any moment. It was absurd, of course. From its present vantage point, the familiar could probably tell precisely where Merlin was in the ship, and give Sora adequate warning, but she still felt uneasy, even as she asked the inevitable question. "What else?" "Oh, plenty. Even some visual records of the man himself, caught on the internal cameras. Sorry, a healthy interest in where he's been is one thing, but spying on him is something else. Would it change things if I told you that Merlin hasn't been totally honest with us? You said he hadn't lied." "Not about anything significant, which makes this all the odder." "There." The familiar sounded quietly pleased with itself. "You're curious now, aren't you?" Sora sighed. "You'd better show me." Merlin's face appeared on the screen, sobbing. He seemed slightly older to her, although it was difficult to tell since most of his face was caged behind his hands. She could hardly make out what he was saying between each sob. "Thousands of hours of this sort of thing," the familiar said. They started out as serious attempts at keeping a journal, but soon deteriorated into a form of catharsis. "I'd say he did well to stay sane at all." "More than you realize. We know he's been gone 10,000 years, just as he told us. Well and good. That's objective time. But he also said that 11 years of ship time had passed." "And isn't that the case?" "I suspect that may be, to put a diplomatic gloss on it, a slight underestimate. By a considerable number of decades. And I don't think he spent much of that time in Frostwatch." Sora tried to remember what she knew of the methods of longevity available to the cohort in Merlin's time. "He looks older than he does now, doesn't he?" The familiar chose not to answer. When the transit to the way was almost over, Merlin called her to the bridge. "We're near the transit node," he said. "Take a seat, because the insertion can be a little interesting." "Transition to Waynet in 300 seconds, said the ship's cloyingly calm voice. The crescent of the cockpit window showed a star field transected by a blurred, twinkling filament, like a solitary wave crossing a lake at midnight. Sora could see blurred stars through the filament, wide as her outspread hand, widening by the second. A thickening in it like a bulge along a snake was the transit node, a point coincidental with the ecliptic, where passage into the accelerated space-time of the way was possible. Although the Waynet stream was transparent, there remained a ghostly sense of dizzying motion. "Are you absolutely sure you know what you're doing?" "Goodness, no." Merlin was reclining back in his seat, booted feet up on the console, hands knitted behind his neck. Ancient orchestral music was piping into the room, building up to a magnificent and doubtlessly delicately timed climax. Which isn't to say that this isn't an incredibly tricky maneuver, of course, requiring enormous skill and courage. What worries me is that you might be right. Sora remembered the times Captain Chagra had sent probes into the Waynet, only to watch as each was shredded, sliced apart by momentum gradients that could flense matter down to its fundamentals. The Waynet twinkled because tiny grains of cosmic dust were constantly drifting into it, each being annihilated in a pretty little flash of exotic radiation. Right now, she thought, they were cruising toward that boundary, dead set on what ought to have been guaranteed destruction. She tried to inject calm into her voice. "So, how did you come by the Syrinx, Merlin?" "Isn't much to look at, you know. A black cone, about as long as you're tall. Even in my era we couldn't make them, or even safely dismantle the few we still had. Very valuable things. The cohort weren't overly thrilled that you stole one, according to the legend. As if they cared. They had so few left, they were too scared to actually use them." Sora buckled herself into her seat. She knew roughly what was about to happen, although no one had understood the details for tens of thousands of years. Just before hitting the way, the Syrinx would chirp a series of quantum gravitational fluctuations at the boundary layer, the skin, no thicker than a plank length, which separated normal space-time from the rushing space-time contained within the way. For an instant, the momentum gradients would relax, allowing the ship to enter the accelerated medium without being sliced. That was the theory, anyway. The music reached its crescendo now, ship's thrust notching higher, pushing Sora and Merlin back into their seats. The shriek of the propulsion system merged with the shriek of violins too harmoniously to be accidental. Merlin's look of quiet amusement did not falter. A cascade of liquid notes played over the music, the song of the Syrinx translated into the audio spectrum. There was a peak of thrust, then the impulse ended abruptly, along with the music. Sora looked to the exterior view. For a moment it seemed as if the stars and the nearer planets and sun of this system hadn't actually changed at all, but after a few seconds she saw that they burned appreciably brighter and, it seemed, bluer in one hemisphere of the sky, redder and dimmer in the other. And they were growing bluer and redder by the moment, and now bunching, swimming like shoals of luminous fish, obeying relativistic currents. A planet slammed past from out of nowhere, distorted as if squeezed in a fist. The system seemed frozen behind them, shot through with red like an iron orrery snatched from the forge. "Transition to Waynet achieved," said the ship. Later, Merlin took her down to the forward observation blister, a pressurized sphere of metasapphire that could be pushed beyond the hull like a protruding eye. The walls were opaque when they arrived, and when Merlin sealed the entry hatch, it turned the same shade of grey, merging seamlessly. "Not to alarm you or anything," the familiar said, "but I can't communicate with the copy of myself from in here. That means I can't help you if—" Sora kissed Merlin, silencing the voice in her head. "I'm sorry," she said, almost instantly. "It seemed—" "Like the right thing to do?" Merlin's smile was difficult to judge, but he did not seem displeased. "No, not really. Probably the wrong thing, actually." "I'd be lying if I said I didn't find you attractive, Sora. And like I said, it has been rather a long time since I had human company." He drew himself to her, their free-floating bodies hooking together in the centre of the blister, slowly turning until all sense of orientation was gone. "Of course, my reasons for rescuing you were entirely selfless." "Of course." "But I won't deny that there was a small glimmer of hope at the back of my mind, the tiniest spark of fantasy." They shed their clothes, untidy bundles which orbited around their coupled bodies. They began to make love, slowly at first, and then with increasing energy, as if it was only now that Sora was fully waking from the long centuries of Frostwatch. She thought of Verdin, and then hated herself for the crass biochemical predictability of her mind, the unfailing way it dredged up the wrong memories at the worst of times. What had happened back then, what had happened between them, was 3,000 years in the past, unrecorded by anything or anyone except herself. She had not even mourned him yet, not even allowed the familiar to give her that particular indulgence. She studied Merlin, looking for hints of his true age, and failed, utterly, to detach the part of her mind capable of the job. "Do you want to see something glorious?" Merlin asked later, after they had hung together wordlessly for many minutes. "If you think you can impress me," he whispered to the ship, causing the walls to lose their opacity. Sora looked around. By some trick of holographics, the ship itself was not visible at all from within the blister. It was just her and Merlin, floating free. And what she saw beyond them was indeed glorious, even if some detached part of her mind knew that the view could not be completely natural, and that in some way the hues and intensities of light had been shifted to aid comprehension. The walls of the Waynet slammed past at eye-wrenching speed, illuminated by the intense, Doppler-shifted annihilation of dust particles, so that it seemed as if they were flying in the utmost darkness down a tube of twinkling violet that reached toward infinity. The space-time in which the ship drifted like a seed moved so quickly that the difference between its speed and light amounted to only 1 part in 100 billion. Once a second, in subjective time, the ship threaded itself through shining hoops as wide as the Waynet itself, constraining rings spaced 8 light-hours apart, part of the inscrutable exotic matter machinery that had serviced this galaxy-spanning transit system. Ahead, all the stars in the universe crowded into an opalescent jeweled mass, hanging ahead like a congregation of bright angels. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "It's the only way to travel," Merlin said. The journey would take 4 days of ship time, 19 centuries of world time. The subjective time spent in Waynet flight amounted only to 23 hours, but the ship had to make many transitions between ways, and they were never closer than tens of light minutes apart, presumably because of the nightmarish consequences that would ensue if 2 opposing streams of accelerated space-time ever touched. "Aren't you worried we'll wander into Huskers, Merlin?" "Worth it for the big reward, wouldn't you say?" "Tell me more about this mystical gun, and I might believe you." Merlin settled back in his seat, drawing a deep breath. "Almost everything I know could be wrong." "I'll take that risk." "Whatever it was fully capable of destroying whole worlds, even stars, if the more outlandish stories are to be believed." He looked down at his hand, as if suddenly noticing his impeccably manicured fingernails. "Ask him how he thinks it works," the familiar said. "Then at least we'll have an idea how thorough he's been." She put the question to Merlin as casually as she could. "Gravity," he said. "Isn't that obvious? It may be a weak force, but there isn't anything in the universe that doesn't feel it." "Like a bigger version of the Syrinx?" Merlin shrugged. Sora realized that it was not his fingernails to which he was paying attention, but the ornate ring she had noticed before, inset with a ruby stone in which 2 sparks seemed to orbit like fireflies. "It's almost certainly the product of Waymaker science, a post-human culture that was able to engineer, to mechanize space-time. But I don't think it worked like the Syrinx. I think it made singularities, that it plucked globules of mass energy from vacuum and squashed them until they were within their own event horizons." "Black holes," the familiar said, and Sora echoed her words aloud. Merlin looked pleased. "Very small ones, atomic scale. It doped them with charge, then accelerated them up to something only marginally less than the speed of light. They didn't have time to decay. For that, of course, it needed more energy, and more still just to prevent itself being ripped apart by the stresses." "A gun that fires black holes. We'd win, wouldn't we? With something like that, even if there was only one of them." Merlin fingered the ruby-scented ring. "That's the general idea." Sora took Merlin's hand, stroking the fingers until her own alighted on the ring. It was more intricate than she had realized before. The twin sparks were whirling around each other, glints of light locked in a waltz, as if driven by some microscopic clockwork buried in the ruby itself. "What does it mean?" she asked, sensing that this was both the wrong and the right question. "It means..." Merlin smiled, but it was a moment before he completed the sentence. "It means, I suppose, that I should remember death." They fell out of the way for the last time, entering a system that did not seem markedly different than a dozen others they had skipped through. The star was a yellow main-sequence sun, accompanied by the usual assortment of rocky worlds and gas giants. The 2nd and 3rd planets out from the sun were steaming hot cauldrons, enveloped by acidic atmosphere at crushing temperature, the victims of runaway heat-trapping processes. The 3rd more recently than the 2nd. The 4th planet was smaller, and seemed to have been the subject of a terraforming operation that had taken place some time after the flourishing. Its atmosphere, though thin, was too dense to be natural. 13 separate ways punched through the system's ecliptic at different angles, safely distant from planetary and asteroidal orbits. "It's a nexus," Merlin said, "a primary Waynet interchange. You find systems like this every 1,000 or so light-years through the plane of the galaxy, and a good way out of it as well. Back when everyone used the Waynet, this system would have been a meeting point, a place where traders swapped goods and tales from halfway to the core. Bit of a dump now, though, isn't it? Perfect for hiding something very big and very nasty, provided you remember where it was you hid it. You mentioned something about a storm. You'll see. The Way had dropped them in the inner part of the system, but Merlin said that what he wanted was further out, beyond the system's major asteroid belt. It would take a few days to reach. "And what are we going to do when we get there?" Sora asked. "Just pick this thing up and take it with us?" "Not exactly," Merlin said. "I suspect it will be harder than that. Not so hard that we haven't got a chance, but hard enough." He seemed to falter, perhaps for the first time since she had known him, that aura of supreme confidence cracking minutely. "What part do you want me to play?" "You're a soldier," he said. "Figure that out for yourself." "I don't know quite what it is I've found," the familiar said when she was again alone. "I've been waiting to show you, but he's had you in those war simulations for hours. Either that or you two have been occupying yourselves in other ways. Any idea what he's planning?" Merlin had a simulator, a smaller version of the combat training modules Sora knew from Warcresh. A lot of the simulations had a common theme, an attack against a white pyramid. Implying some foreknowledge, wouldn't you say? As if Merlin knows something of what he will find? "I've had that feeling ever since we met him." She was thinking of the smell of him, the shockingly natural way their bodies meshed, despite their being displaced by thousands of years. She tried to flush those thoughts from her mind. What they were now discussing was a kind of betrayal, on a more profound level than anything committed so far, because it lacked any innocence. "What is it, then?" "I've been scanning the later log files, and I've found something that seems significant, something that seemed to mark a turning point in his hunt for the weapon. I have no idea what it was, but it took me until now to realize just how strange it was." "Another system?" "A very large structure, nowhere near any star, but nonetheless accessible by Waynet." "A Waymaker artifact, then?" "Almost certainly." The structure was visible on the screen. It looked like a child's toy star or a metallic starfish, textured in something that resembled beaten gold or the luster of insect wings, filigreed in a lacework of exotic matter scaffolds. It filled most of the view, shimmering with its own soft illumination. This is what Merlin would have seen with his naked eyes just after his ship left the Way. "Very pretty." She had meant the remark to sound glib, but it came out as a statement of fact. "And large. The object's more than 10 light-minutes away, which makes it more than 4 light-minutes in cross-section, comfortably larger than any star on the main sequence, and yet somehow it holds itself in shape, in quite preposterous shape, against what must be unimaginable self-gravity. Merlin, incidentally, gave it the name Brittle Star, which seems as good as any." Poetic bastard. Poetic sexy bastard, she thought. "There's more, if you're interested. I have access to the sensor records from the ship, and I can tell you that the Brittle Star is a source of intense gravitational radiation. It's like a beacon, sitting there, pumping out gravity waves from somewhere near its heart. There's something inside it that is making space-time ripple periodically." "You think Merlin went inside it, don't you?" "Something happened, that's for sure." This is the last log Merlin filed on his approach to the object before a month-long gap. It was another mumbled soliloquy, except this time his sobs were of something other than despair. Instead, they sounded like the sobs of the deepest joy imaginable, as if, finally, he had found what he was looking for, or at least knew that he was closer than ever, and that the final prize was not far from reach. But that was not what made Sora shiver. It was the face she saw. It was Merlin, beyond any doubt, but his face was lined with age, and his eyes were those of someone older than anyone Sora had ever known. The 5th and 6th planets were the largest. The 5th was the heavier of the two, zones of differing chemistry banding it from tropic to pole, girdled by a ring system that was itself braided by the resonant forces of 3 large moons. Merlin believed that the ring system had been formed since the flourishing. A cloud of radiation-drenched human relics orbited the world, dating from unthinkably remote eras, perhaps earlier than Waymaker time. Merlin swept the cloud with sensors tuned to sniff out weapon systems, or the melange of neutrino flavors that betokened Husker presence. The sweeps all returned negative. "You know where the gun is?" Sora asked. "I know how to reach it, which is all that matters." "Maybe it's time to start being a little less cryptic, especially if you want me to help you." He looked wounded, as if she had ruined a game hours in the making. "I just thought you'd appreciate the thrill of the chase." "This isn't about the thrill of the chase, Merlin. It's about the nastiest weapon imaginable and the fact that we have to get our hands on it before the enemy so that we can incinerate them first. So we can commit xenocide." She said it again. Xenocide. Sorry, doesn't that conform to your romantic ideals of the righteous quest? "It won't be xenocide," he said, touching the ring again, nervously. "Listen, I want that gun as much as you do. That's why I chased it for 10,000 years. Was it her imagination, or had the ring not been on his hand in any of the recordings she had seen of him? She remembered the old man's hands she had seen in the last recording, the one taken just before his time in the Brittle Star, and she was sure they carried no ring. Now Merlin's voice was matter-of-fact. "The structure we want is on the outermost moon." "Let me guess. A white pyramid?" He offered a smile. "Couldn't be closer if you tried." They fell into orbit around the gas giant. All the moons showed signs of having been extensively industrialized since the flourishing, but the features that remained on their surfaces were gouged by millennia of exposure to sleeting cosmic radiation and micrometeorites. Nothing looked significantly younger than the surrounding landscapes of rock and ice, except for the kilometre-high white pyramid on the 3rd moon, which was in a 16-day orbit around the planet. It looked as if it had been chiselled out of alabaster sometime the previous afternoon. "Not exactly subtle," Merlin said. "Self-repair mechanisms must still be functional, to one degree or another, and that implies that the control systems for the gun will still work. It also means that the counter-intrusion systems will also be operable." "Oh, good." "Aren't you excited that we're about to end the longest war in human history?" "But we're not, are we? I mean, be realistic. It'll take tens of thousands of years simply for the knowledge of this weapon's existence to reach the remotest areas of the war. Nothing will happen overnight." "I can see why it would disturb you," Merlin said, tapping a finger against his teeth. "None of us have ever known anything other than war with the Huskers." "Just show me where it is." They made one low orbital pass over the pyramid, alert for buried weapons, but no attack came. On the next pass, lower still, Merlin's ship dropped proctors to snoop ground defences. "Maybe they had something bigger once," Merlin said, "artillery that could take us out from millions of kilometres. But if it ever existed, it's not working anymore." They made groundfall a kilometre from the pyramid, then waited for all but 3 of the proctors to return to the ship. Merlin tasked the trio to secure a route into the structure, but their use was limited. Once the simple-minded machines were out of command range of the ship, which happened as soon as they had penetrated beyond the outer layer of the structure, they were essentially useless. "Who built the pyramid? And how did you know about it?" "The same culture who got into the war I told you about," he said as they clamped on the armoured carapaces of their suits in the airlock. "They were far less advanced than the Waymakers, but they were a lot closer to them historically, and they knew enough to control the weapon and use it for their own purposes." "How'd they find it?" "They stole it. By then the Waymaker culture was, how shall I put it, sleeping? Not really paying due attention to the use made of its artifacts." "You're being cryptic again, Merlin." "Sorry. Solitude does that to you." "Did you meet someone out there, Merlin? Someone who knew about the gun and told you where to find it?" "And made you young in the process," she thought. "My business, isn't it?" "Maybe once. Now I'd say we're in this together. Equal partners. Fair enough?" "Nothing's fair in war, Sora." But he was smiling, diffusing the remark, even as he slipped his helmet down over the neck ring, twisting it to engage the locking mechanism. "How big is the gun?" Sora asked. The pyramid rose ahead, blank as an origami sculpture, entrance ducts around the base concealed by intervening landforms. Merlin's proctors had already found a route that would at least take them some way inside. "You won't be disappointed," Merlin said. "And what are we going to do when we find it? Just drag it behind us?" "Trust me." Merlin's laugh crackled over the radio. "Moving it won't be a problem."